Welcome to part 3 of the story of Moses. Last time we saw Moses and Pharaoh discussing matters of an exit strategy. And also we saw the excitement at the Red Sea. Now all that behind them, this video will see the Israelites wandering through the desert, running out of food and water, finding an oasis in the desert, and then learning patience not so well at a mountain. So let's begin. When we last left the Israelites, they had just crossed the Red Sea on dry ground, and they saw Pharaoh's horses, chariots, and horsemen drowned when the waters came back. They were delighted with God's power. They sang songs and danced and lived happily ever after. Well, sang songs and danced, yes. Lived happily ever after, not so. Then Moses led Israel from the Red Sea, and they went into the desert of Shur. For 3 days they traveled into the desert without finding any water. When they came to Marah, they could not drink its water, because it was bitter. That is why the place is called Marah. So the people grumbled against Moses, saying, "What are we to drink?" This won't be the last time we hear about the Israelites grumbling. So Moses led them into the desert of Shur. They traveled for 3 days without finding any water. Their water supply was dwindling, or even gone. Imagine how thirsty they were, and probably getting panicky. After all, how much water would you expect to find in a desert? And remember that there are anywhere between 2 and 3 million thirsty people. Now, before we get too critical, there are anywhere between 2 and 3 million people going into the desert. In the book of Numbers, 1st chapter and verses 45 and 46, it says, "All the Israelites 20 years old or more who were able to serve in Israel's army were counted according to their families. The total number was 603,550. Now add women, children, and the elderly. To put this into perspective, Beaver Stadium has a capacity of 107,282. That would mean that at least 20 times the capacity of Beaver Stadium was being led by Moses into the desert. But God answers. He again shows that he can take care of them. In Exodus 15, verses 25 to 27, it says, "Moses cried out to God, and God showed him a piece of wood to throw into the water. When he did this, the water became sweet. Then God told them if they listen to him and follow his commands, he will keep them safe from disease. Then they came to Elim, where there were 12 springs and 70 palm trees, and they camped there near the water." Wow, sounds like a resort to me. You can see their travels so far, from Ramses to Succoth, around the Red Sea, down to Marah and Elim, and now they are about to enter the desert or the wilderness of Sin. Has nothing to do with the sin as the word we know it. The whole Israelite community set out from Elim and came to the desert of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the 2nd month after they had left Egypt. In the desert, the whole community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The Israelites said to them, "If only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted. But you have brought us out into this desert to starve this entire community to death." The journey from Elim, remember what it was like there, an oasis in the desert, to the wilderness of Sin took place 1 month after they left Egypt. The food they brought from Egypt was running out, and they started to feel hungry and even anticipated starving. They went from singing to complaining. How do you get when you get hungry? Are you a little testy while you're waiting to get fed, like a baby when it gets hungry? Now try to imagine a few million hungry people. They began to look back at the past with rose-colored glasses, the good old days of slavery, and as if Moses had evil plans for the people. But how often do we go back and remember the past as the good old days, when they may not have been as good as we remember? Maybe because the past is something we know and the future is unknown. What does that say about our trust in God? And when people start complaining, they don't use good judgment. So in Exodus 16, God answers. He was to rain down bread from heaven in the morning with instructions. Go out each day and gather just enough for that day. It was a test to see if they could or would follow instructions. On the 6th day, they could gather enough for 2 days. If they gathered too much and tried to store it, the extra would spoil. It was full of maggots and began to smell. That's in verse 21. Some also did not gather a double portion on the 6th day, and when they went out on the 7th day, there was none. Some people just can't follow instructions. They called the bread manna, which actually means, what is it? God also promised quail in the evening. Quail was a delicacy of the Egyptians. So bread in the morning and meat in the evening. This was their menu for the next 40 years. God could have brought judgment on them for all their grumbling, but instead had mercy and gave them what they did not deserve. So Exodus 17. The whole Israelite community set out from the desert of Zin, traveling from place to place as the Lord commanded. They camped at Rephidim, but there was no water for the people to drink. So they quarreled with Moses and said, "Give us water to drink." Moses replied, "Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you put the Lord to the test?" But the people were thirsty for water. And they grumbled against Moses. They said, "Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to make us and our children and livestock die of thirst?" Such an unhappy bunch. But lack of food and water can make us that way. Notice they did not complain about the accommodations or the heat. God told Moses to walk ahead of the people and take some of the elders with him. Strike the rock with the same staff he touched the Nile, and water will come out. Moses did what he was told. I'm not quite sure it really looked like this, or maybe it did. All was not easy for the Israelites in the desert. Not only did they need food and water, but there were other people living there, and they did not want the Israelites there also. One such group was the Amalekites. The Amalekites attacked them at Rephidim. Moses told Joshua to pick some men and go fight them. Moses went on top of a hill, and as long as he had his staff held high, Joshua would be winning, but when he lowered his hands, the battle went the other way. So when Moses' hands got tired, remember he was 80, Aaron and Hur put a stone under him to sit, and they would hold his hands up for him. So Joshua won the battle. This is Take Your Father to Work Day. Jethro, priest of Midian and father-in-law to Moses, heard of everything God had done for Moses and for his people Israel, and how the Lord brought Israel out of Egypt. Jethro, together with Moses, his son and wife, came to meet him in the desert, where he was camped near the mountain of God. So Moses went out to meet him. Jethro watches Moses take a seat to serve as judge for the people from morning to evening. Can you imagine what this must have been like with the size of this group of people? Jethro, after watching this, said to Moses, "What are you doing?" Moses responded that when the people have a dispute, they come to me to decide between them. Jethro suggested that Moses select capable men from all the people, men who fear God, trustworthy, and honest, and appoint them as officials over thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. Have them bring the difficult cases to him, and the simple cases they can handle. And Moses listened to his father-in-law and did everything he said. Exodus 19. After 3 months, the Israelites left Egypt. They came to the desert of Sinai. They camped in front of the mountain. It took them 3 months since they left Egypt to arrive here. They stay here for a year. This is covered from Exodus 19 all the way through Numbers 10, or 57 chapters of Scripture. God said to Moses, "I'm going to come to you in a dense cloud, so that all the people will hear me speaking with you, and will always put their trust in you." The people were to wash their clothes, and on the 3rd day the Lord will come down. Be careful that they do not come up the mountain, or touch the foot of it, or they will be put to death. On the morning of the 3rd day there was thunder and lightning, with a thick cloud over the mountain, and a very loud trumpet blast. Everyone in the camp trembled. Then Moses led the people out of the camp to meet with God, and they stood at the foot of the mountain. Mount Sinai was covered with smoke, because the Lord descended on it in fire. The smoke billowed up from it like smoke from a furnace, and the whole mountain trembled violently, and the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder. Then the Lord called to Moses to the top of the mountain, and Moses went up. The Lord told him, "Go down and bring Aaron up with you." Exodus 20. When the people saw the thunder and lightning, and heard the trumpet, and saw the mountain in smoke, they trembled with fear. They stayed at a distance and said to Moses, "Speak to us yourself, and we will listen. But do not have God speak to us, or we will die." The Lord spoke these words. He spoke the 10 Commandments. And then the people were so filled with fear that they wanted God to tell Moses the rest. I can see how Hollywood might be able to repeat the thunder and lightning, and even the mountain trembling. But to be able to duplicate the voice of God, even with the sound systems in the theaters, I don't believe it could be done. God speaking is not just a loud or deep voice, but it fills the entire atmosphere as if it encompasses the very atmosphere around you. The people remained at a distance while Moses approached the thick darkness where God was. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Tell the Israelites this. You have seen for yourselves that I have spoken to you from heaven. Do not make any gods to be alongside me, gods of gold or silver." The people remained at a distance and let Moses approach. Notice what God said. I'm sure that he knew his appearance and voice would upset the Israelites. I think this may be where he gets the phrase, the fear of God, because that is exactly what happened. The rest of these chapters relay all the other commands that God gave Moses to give to them. Remember that they have not known anything but living in slavery. Now they are in the desert, starting a new life, and they need some standard to live by. God is going to do that for them. Then Moses set out with Joshua his aide, and Moses went up on the mountain of God. After 6 days, God entered the cloud as he went up the mountain, and he stayed on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights. When the Lord finished speaking to Moses on Mount Sinai, he gave him the 2 tablets of testimony, the tablets of stone inscribed by the finger of God. God has finished giving his standards, and Moses is ready to return down the mountain. In Exodus 32, when the people saw that Moses was so long in coming down from the mountain, they gathered around Aaron and said, "Come, make us gods who will go before us. As this fellow Moses, who brought us up out of Egypt, we don't know what has happened to him." 40 days is a long time. Maybe they thought Moses slipped and fell and died on the mountain. They were not allowed to go up the mountain, or they would die. How patient would you be? We are not a very patient people. We like to have things happen soon. How long would you wait for a prayer to be answered? A few days? A few months? A few years? How do you handle delays in what you want or expect from God? In some cases, 40 days is a short time, because you may have to wait years to see God's plan. So if you don't get the results from God, what do you turn to? More time at work? Alcohol? Drugs? Sports? What satisfies your craving if God is not responding? What did the Israelites do? Well, Exodus 32. Aaron answered them, "Take off the gold earrings that your wives, your sons, and your daughters are wearing, and bring them to me." So all the people took off their earrings and brought them to him. He took what they handed to him, and he made it into an idol cast in the shape of a calf. Then they said, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you out of Egypt." How quickly they forgot God's command to them. The fear of the Lord did not last. But I do remember the last thing he told the Israelites before he went back up. God told them, "Don't make any gods of silver or gold." Moses was on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights, and that was a long time. But Aaron was left in charge, and he spent a lot of time with Moses and even in the presence of God. So what was Aaron thinking? Well, Exodus 23 or 32. After Aaron saw the calf of gold, he announced what tomorrow there will be a festival to God. Did he think this calf was the image of God? After the people sacrificed burnt offerings, they sat down to eat and drink and then began to party. Then God tells Moses to go down because the people have become corrupt. He calls them a stiff-necked people, stubborn and hard-headed. God says he will destroy them, but still make a nation out of Moses. Moses tried to calm God down by saying that the Egyptians will say that God brought them out of Egypt only to kill them in the mountains. Then Moses reminded God of his promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, also known as Jacob. So God relented. Moses turned and went down the mountain with the 2 tablets. Joshua, who was waiting further down the mountain, said that there is a sound of war in the camp. Moses said it is not the sound of victory or defeat, but the sound of people throwing a party. So in Exodus 32, carry on further, when Moses approached the camp and saw the calf and the dancing, his anger burned, and he threw the tablets out of his hands, breaking them to pieces at the foot of the mountain. Not hard to imagine how Moses felt. He had a close relationship with God and had 40 days and 40 nights with him, and now comes down to find this happening. We probably would have had similar feelings if we were in Moses' sandals. When Moses approached Aaron, the excuse sounds similar to Adam's excuse in the Garden of Genesis. Verse 22, Aaron says, "You know how prone these people are to evil. They said to me, 'Make us gods who will go before us.' As for this fellow Moses who brought us out of Egypt, we don't know what has happened to him. So I told them, 'Whoever has any gold jewelry, take it off.' Then they gave me the gold, and I threw it into the fire. And out came this calf." All I can say is unbelievable. In verse 26, Moses says to the people, "Whoever is for the Lord, come to me." The rest of the chapter tells that many that sinned died either by the sword or a plague. Exodus 33. God tells Moses to leave and take the people to the land he promised. Because they are a stubborn and stiff-necked people, he will not go with them, because he might destroy them on the way. Instead, he will send an angel before them to drive out the people who are living there now. Moses would take a tent and pitch it outside the camp, and the Lord would come down and talk to Moses face to face there. A pillar of cloud would come down and stay at the entrance. In verse 13, Moses pleads with God, "If you are pleased with me, teach me your ways, so I may know you and continue to find favor with you." Moses says, "If God's presence does not go with us, do not send us up from here." God then replies that his presence will go with Moses. Moses now asks for the ultimate. In verse 18, Moses said, "Show me your glory." God says that all his goodness will pass in front of Moses, but he cannot see his face and live. God places Moses in a crack in a rock and covers him with his hand until he passes by. Then God will take his hand away so Moses can see his back, but not his face. At this point, God makes 2 new tablets for Moses and reviews his commands. Verse 29, when Moses came down from Mount Sinai with the 2 tablets of the testimony in his hands, he was not aware that his face was radiant, because he had spoken with the Lord. From this time on, when Moses would meet with God, his face would become radiant, and he would put a veil over his face until he would speak to the Lord again. We are called to reflect God's glory, and I believe that when we accept Jesus, our countenance takes on a different look. There is a new sense that takes place spiritually, and it shows in our face. How about some closing thoughts? In Numbers 12:3, it says that Moses was a very humble man, more humble than anyone else on the face of the earth. Can you now see the humility in Moses? Can you think of reasons why he was humble? Can you think of reasons why he would not be humble? Can you make the same request that Moses in chapter 33 made to God? Teach me your ways. The need of God's presence before you to go ahead, wanting to see God's glory. All very bold requests.